one of the things we want to do this afternoon is celebrate the people who made CHE happen. And I think it's also celebrating the broader community of environmental health. And I was reflecting the other day on a comment from Polly, who Ted mentioned, when we did our CHE Cafe a few weeks back with Ted and Polly and Margaret Kripke, who led the President's Cancer Panel report back in 2008. And one of the questions that I asked at the end of that conversation was, what keeps you motivated? What gives you hope in doing this work? And Polly's comment was, it's the people. It's the people that are in this work that give her hope and energy and keep her motivated. And I think that's true for a lot of us. This work is hard. There's a lot that's pushing us, in a different direction. And it's a long-term work that we're doing, and it does take collaboration that takes work itself. And I think being around people who you can lean into and enjoy and really appreciate and admire, it helps a lot. So I just wanted to bring that into the room. Then really quickly, I wanted to share before I pass it over to Anne, a couple of quotes you'll see in your packet, quotes from the folks who wanted to be here but couldn't, who have been involved in CHE in various ways. The first is from Linda Birnbaum, who many of you know. Linda says, since its founding 20 years ago, CHE has served as a gathering place, unconflicted gathering place for stakeholders to focus on the epidemic of chronic, non-communicable diseases and their environmental causes. I've been honored to work with CHE on numerous topics and help move the needle on understanding and dealing with the environmental impacts on public health. And then an excerpt from the what you'll find there from Elise Miller, who I believe was the first director. So she must be the one that you hired when you did that first series of interviews. In a second. Elise says she wanted to be here. She said, when I think of CHE, I feel enormously privileged to have been in the room at Commonweal when CHE was first conceived and to have served as its director for almost half of CHE's 20-year history. I know others there today will speak to CHE's specific achievements and contributions, so I will simply close by extending my heartfelt gratitude and admiration to all the extraordinary people who have shaped and guided CHE over the years, those who are being recognized today, and the hundreds of others who may not be named but made a huge difference all the same. You know who you are. So with that, I'll hand it over to Anne.
Hello, everyone. It's speaking to the idea of it being the people that keep us all in this work. It is my great honor to introduce this next panel. Ted did a wonderful job doing the segue here from the first panel to the next panel, this coming panel. We've heard from the founders, and now we've heard a little bit about the catalytic effect that CHE has had. And coming back into the Commonweal fold after 20 years or so, I'm remembering that the MO for Commonweal is this quiet sort of background, making everything work and putting things together that need to be put together. And so we're going to do a little deeper dive into one of these effects, the catalytic effects. We've heard about Project Tender. There's also Story of Health and Because Health, which was born here at CHE and then has now found its home with our colleagues at the Center for Environmental Health. But we're going to do a deeper dive here into the UCSF program on reproductive health and the environment. And Alison has suggested that I could spend the next half hour, of course, extolling the work of these wonderful women up on the stage here, but I won't do that. I will give very brief bios, and if you want to know more about them, if you don't already know their work, please go to the website or your packet and look for more. So I'm going to start with Alison Carlson over there on the far side. Alison Carlson is founder and board chair of the Forsythia Foundation. In 2003, she founded and led CHE's Fertility Pregnancy Compromise Work Group, organizing the landmark multidisciplinary workshop which resulted in the acclaimed Vallombrosa Consensus Statement on Environmental Contaminants and Human Fertility Compromise, which in turn inspired the launch of the program on reproductive health and the environment at UCSF. Tracey Woodruff at this end is the director of and Alison S. Carlson Endowed Professor for the program on reproductive health and the environment, professor at the UCSF Department of Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Reproductive Sciences, and the Philip R. Lee Institute for Health Policy Studies. Tracey is a leading scientist who has produced research on how harmful chemicals impact and pollutants impact health, pregnancy, and child development, including the first international study to document the effects of air pollution in preterm birth, and the first to document toxic chemicals in pregnant women and newborns. A national expert in chemical and regulatory policy, Dr. Woodruff was a senior scientist and policy advisor for the EPA's Office of Policy prior to joining UCSF. That's all I have. So Dr. Shanna Swan is professor of environmental medicine and public health at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, one of the world's leading environmental and reproductive epidemiologists, and a professor of environmental medicine and public health. And of course, in 2021, the co-author of the book, Countdown, How Our Modern World is Altering Male and Female Reproductive Development, Threatening Sperm Counts, and Imperiling the Future of the Human Race. And with that lead in, Alison, take it away.
Hi, everybody. Good to see you all. This is a real old home week. Kristen asked me to sort of give you an idea of how the work group, I call it CHE Fertility for short, Fertility and Reproductive Health, came about, and who were some of the key players and what it generated. And I may bore you, some of you here, because you've heard this story before, but the background was that I was an unexplained infertility patient in the late 90s, early 2000s. And I'd grown up along the Hudson River, which many of you know was polluted with PCBs and other things, thanks to GE. I then taught for about 17 years, taught tennis and built a tennis club along the river on land that was bought from Arco and Anaconda Copper, both of whom had illegally hidden hundreds of barrels of PCBs very shallow in the land that we taught on, and then went on to get a degree in human biology from Stanford University. So I was pretty disturbed when I was going through 4 to 5 years of reproductive medicine assistance, asking my docs if growing up there in Hastings and spending so much time on top of barrels of PCBs, which, by the way, I knew from Our Stolen Future were associated with longer time to pregnancy, or was it generations at risk? Anyway, I knew that they were associated to longer time to pregnancy and egg damage. And my doctors didn't really even know what PCBs were. And I was also at the time learning about breast milk contamination. Had Charles Patton's handprints all over that. And it was really disturbing to me. It's untenable that the best thing you can do for your child was full of toxic chemicals, breastfeeding. And I mentioned these books, last night I flew in from out of town and I pulled all these 10 boxes of CHE files that I have in my garage out so that I could remind myself what happened. And I couldn't believe how many things I'd forgotten that we did. But, I'd read Our Stolen Future and Ted and Gina Solomon's Generations at Risk, and this amazing book by Sandra Stein-Graber, who is a wonderful CHE partner, called Having Faith: An Ecologist's Journey to Motherhood. So I was pretty armed compared to my doctors. And because of the breast milk contamination thing, I went to, at the San Francisco Medical Society, I think, Steve, you were behind this, a CDC press conference that Charles Patton was speaking on. And I raised my hand and asked a bunch of questions, and that turned into Charles coming up to me afterwards and saying, "Who are you? Let's have lunch." We had lunch. And that turned into Michael Lerner calling me. And he didn't ask me for a walk, but basically, suddenly my life changed, Steve, as you said. And these guys asked me if I would be interested in organizing a work group of scientists, doctors, patients, groups, advocates, government agency people, all the stakeholders in environmental reproductive health. And I was interested. I'd done that before because I'd spent 20 years organizing doctors and scientists and advocates around sex testing issues in sports. So the function was of interest, but I wanted 3 months to kind of case out the landscape and see if there was a there, talk to some stakeholders and see if this was a good idea. I did that. I called the infertility patient groups, and I spoke to a bunch of researchers mentioned in the bibliography of what had happened was Michael and CHE had just published a peer-reviewed paper by Ted Shetler and Gina Solomon on chemicals in infertility. And we wanted to organize the work group around that. So I spoke to a bunch of people and discovered that there was a there. I called Stanford's Reproductive Endocrinology and Infertility clinic. I had been a patient there and called the head of it, Dr. Linda Giudice, and asked her why Berkeley was so good at environmental health and Stanford sucked. And I was an alum, so I could say that. And Linda said, "I'm so glad you called," because she was a researcher in the endometrium as well as a clinician, and said, "I'm so glad you called because I'm frankly embarrassed that I and my colleagues don't know how to answer patient risk questions on environmental factors." So she joined up. Michael heard about this and said, "Grab her because she's a gold card." She was in Institute of Medicine and NIH. And so she was really, she was a gold card. And so at this point, I basically decided to go ahead with it. It was about 2003, I think, middle of 2003. And it was like a match to dry tinder, it turned out. It was definitely a team effort. I was surrounded suddenly by all these CHE people, some of whom you've heard from, but I want to mention a couple names. Frida Nixdorf, I don't know if you guys remember her, but she was an administrator here with CHE. Eleni Sotos, Steve Heilig for sure, and Vanessa Marcotte, all kind of helped guided me into how you facilitate a work group. I mean, CHE was not an easy thing to understand right away. And then substantively, I was heavily mentored by Pete Myers, Ted Shetler, Gina, Shanna for sure, Lou Gillette, who we've lost, makes me very sad, Theo Colborn, Sarah Jansen. I mean, there were just incredible people surrounding me. Charlotte Brody telling me how to do things, and initial funding by Marnie Rosen and Edith, the wonderful Edith Eddy, who was a real mentor to me from the Compton Foundation. And so I think there was a national conference right after that, CHE's first national conference, and that gave me a chance to speak about what our vision was. And it kind of ballooned from there. So I would say it was matched right to, now it was a conflagration. I mean, it attracted all sorts of advocates from the patient groups, as I mentioned, CEH, EWG representatives, NRDC, EDF, all of the nonprofits that touch on health and environment. Federal and California agencies. We had a whole mess of people from California DHS. And I wish I could just name everybody's names because last night, this is not my makeup bag. This is just some of the selected materials from those 10 boxes. And I looked at the member list halfway through and was going, holy cow, that person was in the group too. People have all gone on to do amazing things. We had EPA representatives, NIEHS, it was Jerry Heindel, and NICHD and EPA, medical professionals, just incredible numbers of clinicians who really, there are just too many to single them out, but I'm so impressed by them and all-star cast of researchers. Shauna here taught me everything I know, I think, about the science. Pat Hunt, Gail Prins, these are all names that CHE people will remember. Brenda Ashkenazi and Irva, I feel so lucky. And there were, an interesting thing was the reproductive rights groups glommed onto CHE fertility, which when I first started looking at the science more seriously, I was worried that what we were about was valuing the fetus because of the fetal origins of adult disease. And I wondered if the anti-choice groups would grab onto this and delegitimize choice. And the repro rights people showed up and explained to me, we've been marginalized as abortion access, but we're really about healthy families when and how we want them. And they really carried forward the work of CHE fertility quite a bit. So And it went from 25 people to 100 to 200 to 400 very quickly, and even larger after I left. And it was taken over by Julia Varshovsky and Karen Russ, who were my successors. Anyway, it was really an amazing village. And as you heard from the earlier panel, we were doing conference calls and discussions of the science every quarter, and created a science abstracts library, thanks to large part to Pete. And it just wrote for publications. A big piece of it was starting special interest groups in professional science and medical societies. We kind of helped folks in this room. Believe it or not, the Endocrine Society didn't have anything on endocrine disruption. And so we were part of helping that get started at the Endocrine Society, but also the American Society of Reproductive Medicine. People were working on ACOG, Society for the Study of Reproduction with Pat Hunt and all of those. So we did briefings on Capitol Hill that I had forgotten about. Worked with Senator Boxer's office on trying to get more appropriations for environmental health, and just talks galore with Ted and Pete and Charles and Michael at medical schools and lots of professional society meetings. So, and then of course, and I'm coming to it toward the end here, but there was Vallombrosa, which you've heard about, which was a workshop of the 45 sort of the best leaders I knew across the various scientific disciplines, and doctors and the patient advocates and government representatives, agency reps. It was a 3-day conference with 45 people done on $14,000, which I don't know how it did. Made everybody work for free. And that generated the Vallombrosa Consensus Statement, which became kind of a model for a process for the other working groups in CHE. And we hand-produced this lay version of the Consensus Statement, which, a funny story about that I just have to tell. Sorry if I'm going to bore you here, Pete, but writing the Consensus Statement took 10 months, and it was so much work. I'm a layperson, not a scientist, and we had 39 signatories, and we had 4 rounds of reviews. Pete did the original drafting out of the meeting. And in order to get this thing edited and reviews, Pete and I were the co-editors, and he was so busy, I had to chase him. I figured out when he was in a layover in what airport, and I would fly to that airport to grab him and sit down for 2 or 4 hours at a Starbucks to write this goddamn thing. Anyway, so, but that was a really important process. Shanna's going to talk a little bit more about Vallombrosa and its aims, but we ended up publishing it in SRM, a journal. Can't remember what SRM stands for.
Society for Reproductive Medicine.
Thank you. And what that meant was that now that consensus statement, what we could say about chemicals and fertility compromise, was searchable on Medline. So that was very significant. And Linda Giudice and I were Compton was the sponsor, and Linda and I were the co-chairs. And we always knew that we wanted to do this workshop, see how it went, and then do a much larger global meeting. And so it just so happened that at the time, we tried to do it initially at Stanford. Stanford was glacial, not picking up on it. But Linda was being recruited as chair of OB-GYN and reproductive sciences at UCSF. And I said, this is great. Tell them the condition of you going there is that you're going to get $250,000 from Dean Kessler, which he did, to start a program on reproductive health and the environment. And Tracey will talk more about that. But that conflagration turned into what comes after a fireball. And right, and a lot of publications out of that. Thank God. What happened was Linda did this paper to conceive of what PRE would be. And dear Phil Lee called me up one day and said, "There's this lady at my Health Policy Institute who's on detail from the US EPA. She wants to say you and Linda should talk to her." And that was Tracey Woodruff. I think the best hire I've ever been involved with. And anyway, so I was exhausted after a year of 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, trying to get that summit that launched the program in 2007, where Dick Jackson was a keynote speaker. Thank you. And so I kind of stood back, and Julia Varshovsky and Karen Russ worked with Tracey and Pri to get ACOG really involved and on board with environmental reproductive health, and did a fantastic workshop on women's health and the environment, trying to look and see if there was a corollary to testicular dysgenesis syndrome. And we called it ovarian dysgenesis syndrome. So looking back, it was incredibly ballsy stuff. I didn't know at the time what a BHAG it was. And it was really all activated by the central core role that CHE was established for, which was, I called setting the table, or you guys called it that. It just was, I want to just tell a last story really quickly about one of the participants in the Vallombrosa workshop, and that was Dr. Russ Hauser from Harvard School of Public Health, who did a lot of work on phthalates, PCBs, and male reproductive health. It was like pulling teeth to get him to come present on male reproductive disorders and chemicals, because he didn't do advocacy. He didn't do advocates. He was pure science and was nervous about getting associated with it, but I got him there. And at the end of 3 days, at the end, I'm going to cry thinking about it, because he almost cried. He stood up and he said, "Oh my God, I didn't really know what to expect here. I only ever speak at scientific conferences. And to spend 3 days with you people and realize that that patients were actually consumers of his science and promoters of the need for funding for it was so moving for him." He then became one of the most proactive CHE partners. And similar with Jerry Heindel, he didn't really want much to do with Commonweal's organic food, and bugged me no end at the workshop that I didn't have Diet Pepsi. I had to run out and get 2 or 3 6-packs of Diet Pepsi for him, or he wasn't going to participate. And he look at this now. I mean, Jerry Heindel became a CHE partner, a champion, and ends up retired, working through Commonweal, now EHS, establishing the HEEDS group, Endocrine Disruption Strategy Group, and he's doing great things. And I look at Russ Hauser and Jerry Heindel as just 2 examples of 100 of people who have gone out into the world and done amazing things, to be followed up by Tracey. Oh, Shanna's going first.
Thank you. What I want to do is start with the goals of the Vallombrosa Statement, and then maybe we can talk about how our goals have changed or not. But before I do that, I just want to, because everybody's giving history, so I just want to tell you one really fun story, which was in 1997, I presented an analysis of sperm decline worldwide at the UN, which was my analysis of the Carlson paper that had come out in 1992 saying sperm. What?
Not me.
No, sorry, another Carlson, Elizabeth Carlson in Denmark, saying that sperm count had declined 50% in 50 years. I don't know how many people remember that. Yeah, so that was a really, really controversial paper, right? And when I read it, I didn't believe it. And I was on the National Academy of Sciences panel committee on hormonally active agents in the environment. That was the name they picked because it was less threatening than endocrine disruptors, right? So I did this analysis, didn't believe this paper, tried to make the results go away, spent 6 months doing that, and it didn't change the results to the first decimal place. This was a really, really solid result. So I had to publish it, and I spoke about it in 1997 at the UN. I presented it, and someone came up to me and said, "You have to meet Pete Myers." And I said, "Who's Pete Myers?" And the rest is history. Thank you, Pete. So that was my introduction to the field, and now I'm going to go over to the Vallombrosa Statement, which was a little bit later, not that 8 years later, so 2005. So the goals were to evaluate and integrate results from diverse research relevant disciplines related to environmental factors and human infertility. And I think we have come a long way in integrating and evaluating those results. To identify conclusions regarding environmental causes of reduced fertility that can be drawn with confidence from existing data. This is still a challenge, isn't it? I mean, I am asked all the time, yes, sperm counts have declined. You've shown that. Why? And when you get to the why question and the evidence for that and saying what % of that decline is due to environmental factors, I actually can't answer that question. I think that is a challenge that we have in front of us that we all should be working on. How do you answer that question? How much of it is lifestyle? How much of it is, I don't think genetics is playing a role, but I can't rule it out, particularly with epigenetics. So I think that's a challenge that remains from 2005. To establish a research agenda that would help resolve uncertainties remaining in the field. Well, that's an ongoing goal, isn't it? So I have to say we've made huge progress on many non-persistent EDCs and their role in reproductive health and other developmental systems. I think we've learned the importance of critical windows in development and the importance of these for all health outcomes, actually, because if you mess up the hormonal system during fetal development, you're going to get permanent changes, irreversible changes that are going to affect the organism for its entire lifespan. I think this is something we did not see clearly at that time that we now know. We know that there are other chemicals than those we originally looked at. I was drawn to phthalates when John Brock said to me, Shanna, you should study phthalates. And I said, why should I study phthalates? And I did. But past phthalates, we went to BPA, and this enormous amount that we learned about dose response and sensitivity at low doses, and which we didn't know then. We didn't know that. We all believed, I think, at the beginning, that the dose makes the poison. Well, thanks to the work of, again, I have to say Pete and others that I work with and you all work with, we know that's too simple, that biology is not that simple. And this complication that we now are dealing with is changing all of our risk assessments and all of our responses to in these environmental exposures. So that's new. That's new. So we also have new endpoints. I think we're much more, starting to look at female endpoints that we hadn't looked at before. Sperm count was very, big in your face, right out there, as men are, but the female outcomes are much less studied for the simple reason, I think, that the female reproductive organs are not accessible.
It's Bermuda Triangle down there.
Exactly. You can't look at the quality of an egg the way you can at the morphology motility of a sperm. So it's just much, much more difficult. That's a challenge that we have in front of us. And I think we have to recognize that these early changes actually are not separate from diseases of later life, whether they're neurodevelopmental or whether they're cancer and so on, but they are predictors of it. Mm-hmm. We now know that poor sperm count or reproductive failure predicts earlier death. That's huge. We've now tied those early prenatal exposure to a whole life course of disease, and that's new. I think we have new methods of understanding risk assessment and the fact that we have to include human relevant exposures, right? I don't think we knew that very clearly back then, that what are we exposed to? We're exposed to mixtures. We're exposed to low doses. We're exposed via many routes of exposure. That's not how chemicals are evaluated. One at a time, one route, monotonic dose response. That's still still the paradigm that is most widely expected. That, I think, is a major challenge to us now, that we have to change people's thinking about how to evaluate risks in human relevant scenarios. And I think we are going to be facing a real challenge now with the problem of what do we do about animal testing. And this is something that many agencies are now thinking of phasing out. And in fact, I believe that we absolutely need those animal tests to evaluate our science and evaluate risks to humans. And I don't think you can do it in a test tube. We can have some discussion about that. I think we should. But I think this question is now a question that the field is facing. You know, where do we go next if we can't do animal testing? So I'm going to stop there. I think that just gives you an idea of some of the challenges we're facing that we weren't facing at the time of Vallombrosa. And I hope this wonderful group will, continue to act and work together to understand these challenges. And finally, I just want to say that I think we have to do better at talking to non-scientists. I think that that's one of the things I learned when I was talking about Countdown. And Joe Rogan's listened to me, and I had a good time talking to him. But at the end, he said, "Do you mean that we're poisoning ourselves and maybe threatening the survival of the species?" Maybe he didn't say it exactly like that, but that was the idea. And I said, "Yes." And then he said, "Well, how come we don't know about this?" That is a challenge I put to you. I think is maybe the biggest challenge we have now. We've done wonderfully at talking amongst ourselves, at forming our groups. But when I go into a meeting and I say, how many people here know what an endocrine disrupting chemical is? I don't get a lot of hands. That's my challenge to you.
Okay. Well, I'm going to wrap up. Speed up history here. That's not possible, actually, because time is fixed, unless you're Einstein. So I just want to say thank you, because I think one thing that is a lesson from this that we've already heard is the connecting function of Che. And I got connected to Alison because of Che, though I was connected to Phil Lee originally. I'm just really glad that people talked about him. I know he can't be with us because he passed away. But I was a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute for Health Policy Studies because Phil, I don't actually know if you know this, he wanted to start an environmental health policy program there. And the person he recruited to do it went off to go do something else. So I was kind of floundering, it's true. But then I went to EPA, migrated to EPA with Phil at that time, and then came back and was able to be reconnected with Phil and Alison and got to participate. You didn't mention the Che Summit, the Che UCSF Summit on reproductive challenges, environmental challenges, reproductive infertility.
Well, I did say it was going to be a global
And it
thing,
was.
and you're supposed to describe it.
Oh, I'm supposed to describe it. Well, I'm going to say, so that's the first thing, connections. Like we have connections and they're continuing to go. The second thing is disruptors, right? I mean, if you hear these stories, there's a lot of disruption in the field that's moved in a positive direction. And the Che UCSF Summit brought over 400 people from all these sectors, scientists, advocates, media, government officials, healthcare professionals, all to talk about what had been growing from these books you have in your bag, right? To all get together to talk about, wow, there's a lot of science here. What's the state of the science and what are we going to do about it? So I think that's the thing that we're really, is kind of at this, now we're at this transitionary, maybe we were at that transitionary point, but now we feel it more acutely about what are we going to do about all this science? Because I mean, I'm at UCSF and I do research and I love research, but I have to say, I'm also, I'm going to notice the other thing about this is impatient because we have a lot of science. So what are we going to do with that science to do something to improve the health of everybody? Like you said, we have a global crisis. So I think one of the things that was really important about the summit was that we got to all get together and come up with an agenda. You can get this lovely book in the back, and there's many more of these consensus agenda statements in the back. But I think the important point is that there was a research agenda, which Shanna really described very eloquently, which we've seen growth in this area of environmental influences on health and disease, not only in reproduction and fertility, but in neurodevelopment and both neurodevelopment and aging and cancer. And we're starting to see, penetration among, though I have to say it's still slow, among these groups. So I think that was a very important thing. But then the part was, well, then how do we use the science to make actual change? And that is the part that I think really got coalesced at the summit, was change the rules of the game, because the game is fixed against the science and the public health, right? And then how do we improve our political and power, which you mentioned, to make the changes in the rules of the game to favor us and not corporate interests? I'm just going to name them because they're a barrier to change, right? We don't really talk about that here, but I just want to name that. So I think the two things that we did was, okay, who are powerful people that can help us make change? And I'm also going to name this because it's doctors, right? They have a personal relationship with their patients. They have a lot of influence in the healthcare field, and they speak with a lot of authority outside. So that was our focus, is like, how do we get doctors to care about this issue? And so we, as you said, we started our work. You had worked with ASRM and the Endocrine Society, so we went after ACOG, American Congress of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. I mean, literally went after them, like trailed them at meetings, and no, I didn't beg, but maybe. So our goal was to, how do we get this organization that at that time had published one article on environment, which was whether flying on a plane would expose you to radiation when you were pregnant, and that was that an issue or not. That was the only article that ever published on the environment. How do we get that organization to adopt the environment as an issue, environmental chemicals as an issue they should care about and advocate, right? Because they have a very powerful advocacy voice, particularly in Washington, D.C., if we're trying to think about our third area, which is change the systems, the structural changes to benefit, right? Because if you change the rules of the game and the structures, then you don't have to worry about whether you go to the store and buy something and it has chemicals in it. So we, because of the work that Alison had done to connect us, because we were at UCSF, because we were able to take advantage, I think this is another important piece of this, moments in time. Like, Alison, your story is so powerful about your personal journey through this, that you took advantage of that moment in time to connect with Linda. Like, those are unique moments in time that then change the direction of the whole field. Like, that wouldn't have happened without that. So our moment in time was that because of the summit, somebody from ACOG had come from the region. There was a law that was being passed, probably being promoted by Ken Cook's organization, EWG, to get rid of lead in lipstick. Was that yours?
We were one of them, yeah.
So somebody called up ACOG and they're like, what do you think about this bill? And the woman who's head of it, Jeannie Connery's like, I don't know, lead in lipstick, why is there lead in lipstick? I don't even know anything about this. And so she's like, wow, I should really know something about this. Oh yeah, UCSF, they know something about this. And we're like, boom, got connected to them. And then we started to work on the consensus statement that ACOG eventually adopted with ASRM. And then that they said, yes, environmental reproductive health is a part of obstetrical care, gynecological care. And then that went on to see, like, we changed that. And now they publish it regularly. It's a regular thing. And then it went international with Vigo. So we went from, by taking the things that had been put in place and just focus them into one of the influential obstetrical groups in the United States, we were able to change the nature of that conversation. And so then it's like, well, wow, ACOG recognizes that this is an important issue. What should we have them do on behalf of this issue? So I don't know if we're going to talk about this here, but one of the things that environmental groups have been working on for many years, I think you said that your group used to be called Toxic something or other, and then it became CHE. Well, the thing that we were all working on was the Toxic Substances Control Act. So people don't know that. I'm just going to call it TSCA. It controls all the chemicals in the United States. It's the law that controls chemicals in the United States. It's kind of loosely defined, but EWG have been working on it. A lot of the NGOs and the states have been working on this. And so that's the thing. We change how that, because that's one of the things in here is like, make every chemical on the market have data so we know whether it's safe or not. And then we do that through TSCA, right? So there was a time in DC where this law was actually going to be happening. And there we got ACOG to go be at the table. And because ACOG was at the table, the law did pass. It's not ideal. We can debate that in another meeting. But the key was they have to make their regulations based on the most sensitive subpopulations, which includes pregnant women. It's like 2 words in this law, but that's because ACOG was there saying you have to put pregnant women in this law. So I feel like that's a big success. Now whether EPA will do it and how they're going to do it, that's all down the road. But that is just an example of the, where you start with someone's personal story. And people know me, I'm really more of a data person, not a story person. But then you go through these ripple effects that we can see actual changes that happen. And I know there's more to come. So I just want to say thank you for starting this. It was really amazing.
I want to add something. I'm sure they're trying to turn off my mic. But Tracey, there was no program in a leading health sciences campus anywhere. And it is a huge deal, the fireball I'm talking about, that Tracey and Linda started at UCSF, creating PRE, and now it's an even bigger deal with the Earth Center there. That is a huge accomplishment. And now there are academic centers that, are kind of following in your footsteps. But Tracey, you're incredible what you built there. So I just want to.
Thank you.